Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Perfect Facade. David Mitchell stood in his pristine garage, admiring the gleaming tools hanging in perfect rows along the pegboard wall. Everything in his life had its place, just like everything in this garage. At 42, he built an empire from nothing. Mitchell Construction had grown from a one-man operation to the largest commercial building company in 3 counties. His calloused hands, scarred from years of honest labor, now wore a platinum wedding ring that caught the morning light. The house behind him was a testament to his success, a sprawling colonial on 12 acres, complete with a workshop that rivaled any professional facility. David had built it himself, every beam and nail placed with the precision that had made him wealthy. But more than that, he built it for his family, for Claire, his wife of 15 years, and their son Ryan. Claire Mitchell was everything David thought he'd wanted in a wife when they'd met at a charity fundraiser. Beautiful in that polished way that money could buy, she'd been working as an event coordinator for the city's elite social functions. Her blonde hair always perfectly styled, her smile bright enough to charm any room. She'd seemed impressed by his rough-around-the-edges success story, and he'd been captivated by her sophistication. But David had always been a man who paid attention to details. Lately, those details had been painting a picture he didn't like. Claire's late nights had become more frequent, her explanations more elaborate. The way she guarded her phone, the new lingerie that never seemed to make an appearance at home, the sudden interest in fitness classes that ran well into the evening. Ryan, their 14-year-old son, had his father's build but his mother's features. The boy was David's pride, smart, athletic, and showing signs of inheriting the Mitchell work ethic. David had been teaching him carpentry and basic construction, hoping to pass down more than just money to the next generation. David's phone buzzed with a text from his foreman, Miguel Santos. The Rodriguez Medical Center project was ahead of schedule, which meant a hefty bonus payment. David had learned early that in construction, reputation was everything, and Mitchell Construction had earned its reputation by delivering quality work on time, every time. He walked back toward the house, his steel-toed boots crunching on the gravel driveway. Claire's Mercedes was gone, another one of her mysterious errands. David had built his success on reading people and situations, and every instinct he'd honed over 2 decades in business was telling him that his marriage was built on a foundation of lies. As he entered through the mudroom, David noticed Claire's planner lying open on the kitchen counter. Her handwriting filled the squares: doctor appointments, lunch dates, fitness classes. But one entry made him pause. TB, 2 p.m., Overlook Hotel. The Overlook was 30 miles away, hardly convenient for any legitimate appointment Claire might have. David pulled out his phone and dialed his private investigator, Frank Morrison. Frank was an ex-cop who'd done security work for several of David's projects. Trustworthy, discreet, and thorough. "Frank, it's David Mitchell. I need you to do some work for me. Personal this time." Chapter 2. Cracks in the Foundation. 3 weeks later, Frank Morrison sat across from David in the private office above Mitchell Construction's main warehouse. The manila envelope between them seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. David's jaw was set in the hard line that his employees had learned to respect and fear. "I'm sorry, David. I know this isn't what you wanted to hear." Frank's weathered face showed genuine sympathy. He'd delivered bad news to a lot of men over the years, but David Mitchell was different. Frank had seen the controlled fury building behind those steel-gray eyes. The photographs spilled across the desk like evidence at a crime scene. Claire entering the Overlook Hotel. Claire leaving with a man David recognized as Trevor Baldwin, the city's planning commissioner. Trevor kissing Claire in the parking lot of an upscale restaurant. Trevor's hands on Claire in ways that made David's vision blur with rage. "How long?" David's voice was deadly quiet. "Best I can tell, about 8 months. Started around the time Baldwin got appointed to the Planning Commission." Frank hesitated. "David, there's more. Baldwin's been fast-tracking permits for certain contractors, companies that are undercutting your bids by margins that shouldn't be possible." David studied the photographs of his wife with Trevor Baldwin. Baldwin was everything David wasn't: smooth, political, the kind of man who'd never built anything with his own hands, but was happy to profit from other men's work. Tall and lean where David was broad and muscular. Expensively dressed where David preferred worn jeans and work shirts. "The Hartley Shopping Complex," David said. pieces clicking into place. We were the low bidder by 200,000. Lost it to Apex Construction. Apex is owned by Baldwin's brother-in-law. Check the permit dates. Frank slid another folder across the desk. Everything expedited. Inspections passed without the usual delays. Very convenient. David's hands clenched into fists. It wasn't just his marriage being destroyed. It was his business, his reputation, everything he'd built from nothing. Claire wasn't just cheating. She was helping another man steal from him. There's something else, Frank continued. Baldwin's divorce was finalized last month. Big settlement to his ex-wife. Word is he's looking to make some quick money to cover his debts. David stood and walked to the window overlooking his construction yard. 40 employees counted on Mitchell Construction for their livelihoods. Miguel had 3 kids and a wife to support. Tommy Chun was putting his daughter through medical school on his crane operator salary. These weren't just jobs. They were families, futures, dreams that Claire and her lover were casually destroying. Keep watching them, David said. But be more careful. I don't want them spooked. Not yet. That evening, David sat at the dinner table watching Claire serve Ryan his favorite meal, meatloaf and mashed potatoes. She was playing the role of devoted mother and wife, asking Ryan about his soccer practice, reminding him about his upcoming math test. The performance was flawless, which made it even more disgusting. "How was your day, honey?" Claire asked, her hand briefly touching David's shoulder as she passed behind his chair. "Productive," David replied, cutting his meatloaf with surgical precision. "The Rodriguez project is ahead of schedule. Should wrap up by month's end." "That's wonderful. Maybe we can plan a little vacation when it's finished. Ryan's been working so hard in school, and I know you've been stressed with work." David looked up at his wife's perfectly made-up face. The same face that had been pressed against Trevor Baldwin's neck in one of Frank's photographs. "Where did you have in mind?" "Oh, I don't know. Maybe somewhere warm. I was talking to Margaret earlier, and she mentioned how nice the weather's been in Florida." Margaret was Claire's mother, and David had never liked the woman. She'd made it clear from the beginning that she thought Claire was marrying beneath herself. Margaret had money from her late husband's insurance business, and she'd never let David forget that his wealth was newer, dirtier, earned with sweat instead of inherited. "Grandma said she might visit soon," Ryan added, brightening. "She promised to take me to that new sports complex." David nodded and smiled at his son, but his mind was working. Margaret would visit soon, which meant Claire would want to play the perfect daughter-in-law. It would be the ideal time to make his move. Chapter 3. The Hit and Run. The call came at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. David was reviewing blueprints for a new office complex when his phone rang with the hospital's number. The words hit him like a physical blow. "Hit and run, critical condition, coma." David's hands shook as he drove to St. Mary's Hospital, his pickup truck weaving through traffic. Ryan had been riding his bike home from soccer practice when a car had slammed into him at the intersection near their neighborhood. The driver had fled the scene. At the hospital, David found Claire in the waiting room, tears streaming down her face. For a moment, his anger was forgotten in the face of their shared terror. Their son, their beautiful, innocent son, was fighting for his life. "The doctors say he has a severe head injury," Claire sobbed into David's chest. "They don't know if he'll wake up." David held his wife, breathing in the familiar scent of her perfume, feeling the familiar comfort of her body against his. In that moment, none of the betrayal mattered. Only Ryan mattered. Dr. Amanda Foster, the neurosurgeon, explained the situation in clinical terms that felt like knives. Traumatic brain injury. Induced coma. Wait and see. The next 72 hours would be critical. David set up camp in Ryan's room, leaving only for the most essential business matters. Claire seemed to drift in and out, taking calls from friends and family, updating everyone on Ryan's condition. David noticed she stepped out into the hallway for many of these calls, but he was too focused on his son to care about her phone habits. On the third day, Claire's mother Margaret arrived from her home in Virginia. Margaret Fisher was a thin, sharp-featured woman in her 60s who wore her wealth like armor. She'd never forgiven David for taking her daughter away from the social circles she'd planned for Claire to marry into. "How is he?" Margaret asked, genuinely concerned about her grandson. "No change," David replied from his chair beside Ryan's bed. "But the swelling in his brain is going down. The doctors say that's encouraging." Margaret settled into the chair on the other side of Ryan's bed, her expensive handbag clutched in her lap. I was so shocked when Claire called. A hit and run. What kind of monster hits a child and just drives away? David had been wondering the same thing. The police had no leads, no witnesses, no security cameras, no debris left behind that might identify the vehicle. It was as if the car had appeared out of nowhere, destroyed their lives, and vanished. That evening, while Margaret sat with Ryan, David stepped out to get coffee. He found Claire in the family lounge, talking on her phone. Her voice was hushed, but he caught fragments. I know. I'm scared too. Can't see you right now. When this is over. David felt the familiar cold rage building in his chest. Even now, with their son in a coma, Claire was talking to her lover. He wanted to grab the phone and confront her, but something stopped him. Instead, he quietly returned to Ryan's room, his mind working. The next morning brought devastating news that should have been joyful. Dr. Foster approached with a puzzled expression. Mr. Mitchell, I need to ask you about something. The blood work we ran on Ryan when he was admitted, there are some irregularities that don't match his medical history. What kind of irregularities? His blood type is listed in his pediatric records as O positive, but our tests show AB negative. It's possible there was a clerical error in his earlier records, but I wanted to verify. David felt the world shift beneath his feet. He was O positive. Claire was a positive. There was no way their biological child could be AB negative. Are you sure about the test results? We ran them twice to be certain. Mr. Mitchell, is there any possibility that Ryan was adopted or... David couldn't hear the rest of the doctor's words over the roaring in his ears. 15 years of marriage, and now he was discovering that his son, the boy he'd loved, trained, planned to leave his business to, wasn't even his. That afternoon, Claire was on the phone again, this time with Margaret. David heard her from the hallway. I don't know what to do, Mom. I never thought it would matter. David loves him so much. Margaret's voice was sharp, worried. Claire, you said you'd handle this years ago. If David finds out now. David pressed himself against the wall, straining to hear more, but Claire had moved further away. When he entered the room a few minutes later, both women were sitting quietly beside Ryan's bed, picture-perfect portraits of concerned family members. That night, alone in the hospital room while Claire and Margaret went to get dinner, David stared at the boy he'd raised as his son. Ryan's features, which David had always attributed to Claire's side of the family, now seemed foreign. The shape of his eyes, the line of his jaw, David found himself seeing Trevor Baldwin in the unconscious boy's face. 14 years old. If Ryan was Baldwin's son, the affair had been going on much longer than Frank had discovered. David's entire marriage had been a lie from the beginning. Chapter 4. The Revelation. On the 5th day, Ryan's eyes fluttered open. David was alone in the room, having sent Claire and Margaret to the cafeteria. The boy's voice was weak, confused, but he was awake and aware. Daddy. Ryan's voice was barely a whisper. I'm here, son. David gripped Ryan's hand, tears streaming down his face. You're going to be okay. The car. Ryan's eyes struggled to focus. I remember the car. Don't worry about that now. Just rest. But Ryan was agitated, trying to sit up. Daddy, I need to tell you. The car that hit me. His young voice cracked with emotion. It was Grandma's car. I saw the license plate right before it hit me. KMF 847. I memorized it because those are Grandma's initials. David felt his blood turn to ice. Margaret's license plate. Margaret had hit Ryan and fled the scene. Are you sure, son? I'm sure, Daddy. The silver Honda with the Virginia plates. But Grandma wouldn't hit me and drive away, would she? Maybe someone stole her car. David's mind raced. Margaret had arrived at the hospital the day after the accident, claiming she'd driven straight from Virginia when Claire called. But Virginia was an 8-hour drive. If she'd left immediately after Claire's call, she would have arrived much later. Ryan, this is very important. Don't tell anyone else about this yet, okay? Not even Mom or Grandma. Let me figure out what happened first. Ryan nodded weakly. Okay, Daddy. But I'm not wrong. It was her car. That afternoon, while Margaret was in the hospital gift shop and Claire was meeting with Dr. Foster, David slipped out to the parking garage. Margaret's silver Honda Accord sat in the visitor section, Virginia plates reading KMF 847. David walked slowly around the vehicle, his trained eye noting the details. The front bumper had been recently repaired. The paint was slightly newer than the rest of the car. There were scratches along the right side that looked fresh. Most telling of all, There was a small dent in the hood that matched the height of a bicycle handlebar. David pulled out his phone and took pictures from every angle, then called Frank Morrison. Frank, I need you to run a plate for me. Virginia KMF, 847. And check recent body shop work in this area and in Northern Virginia. 2 hours later, Frank called back. David, this is strange. That plate belongs to Margaret Fisher, but according to the Virginia DMV, she reported the car stolen 3 days ago. Filed a police report and everything. Stolen. Gets better. I found a body shop in Richmond that did emergency work on a silver Honda last week. Paid cash, no insurance claim. The customer gave a fake name, but the description matches Margaret Fisher. David closed his eyes. Margaret had hit Ryan, fled the scene, driven back to Virginia, had the car repaired, then reported it stolen to cover her tracks. She'd planned to arrive at the hospital playing the concerned grandmother, never expecting Ryan to remember the license plate. That evening, David watched Margaret fuss over Ryan, bringing him magazines and candy from the gift shop. She kissed his forehead and told him how worried she'd been. The performance was flawless, just like her daughter's. I'm so glad you're going to be okay, sweetheart, Margaret cooed. When I got Claire's call, I was just sick with worry. I got in the car immediately and drove straight here. David stood in the doorway, studying his mother-in-law with new eyes. Margaret had always been protective of Claire, always suspicious of David. Had she known about the affair? Had she been trying to eliminate the complication that Ryan represented? Later, when Claire was on another of her mysterious phone calls, David confronted Margaret in the hallway. We need to talk, he said quietly. Margaret's eyes narrowed. About what, David? About the car accident. About why you really came here. About how long you've known about Claire and Trevor Baldwin. Margaret's face went white, but she quickly composed herself. I don't know what you're talking about. Your car hit Ryan. He remembered the license plate. You fled the scene, had the car repaired, and reported it stolen to cover your tracks. Margaret looked around frantically, making sure no one could overhear. You can't prove anything. I can prove everything. The question is what we do about it. For a long moment, they stared at each other. Finally, Margaret spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. It was an accident. I was upset after talking to Claire, not paying attention. When I realized what I'd done, I panicked. Upset about what? Margaret's composure cracked. She told me she was going to leave you, that she was in love with Trevor and wanted to start over. I told her she was being foolish, that she had a good life with you. We were arguing on the phone when I hit Ryan. So you decided to cover it up and let the police waste time looking for a phantom hit-and-run driver. I thought he would be okay. I didn't know he was hurt so badly. Margaret's voice rose, then dropped again. Claire can never know it was me. It would destroy her. David stepped closer, his presence intimidating in the narrow hospital corridor. Here's what's going to happen, Margaret. You're going to help me with something. And if you refuse, I'll not only turn you in for the hit and run, but I'll make sure everyone knows that you almost killed your own grandson to protect your daughter's affair. Margaret's face crumpled. What do you want? I want Claire to pay for what she's done. And you're going to help me make that happen. Chapter 5. The Mother's Web. David spent the next week planning while maintaining the facade of the devoted husband and father. Ryan was recovering well, expected to make a full recovery, though he'd be in the hospital for another few days. Claire continued her performance as the concerned wife, though David noticed she was becoming increasingly agitated. Margaret, on the other hand, was now completely under David's control. The hit-and-run evidence was his insurance policy, and Margaret knew it. She'd agreed to help him, though she didn't yet know the full scope of what David had planned. The first phase began when David asked Margaret to invite Claire for a private mother-daughter lunch. Tell her you need to discuss something important about the family, David instructed. Make it sound serious. Margaret made the call while David listened from the next room. Claire, darling, I need to speak with you privately. There are some things about our family that you need to know. Things about your father's business that affect your future. Claire agreed to meet Margaret at the Riverside Country Club, one of Margaret's usual haunts. David had chosen the location carefully, public enough that Claire wouldn't suspect anything, but private enough for the conversation David needed to happen. While Claire was at lunch with her mother, David paid a visit to Trevor Baldwin's office at City Hall. Baldwin was everything David had expected: smooth, confident, the kind of man who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. Mr. Mitchell, to what do I owe the pleasure? Baldwin stood from behind his mahogany desk, extending a manicured hand. David didn't take it. Instead, he closed the office door and sat down uninvited. "We need to discuss my wife." Baldwin's face went carefully neutral. "I'm not sure I understand." "Sure you do. Claire Mitchell. The woman you've been sleeping with for the past 8 months. The woman who's been feeding you information about my construction bids." Baldwin sat down slowly, his political instincts kicking in. "Mr. Mitchell, I think there's been some misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding." David pulled out a manila folder and spread several photographs across Baldwin's desk. "This is you and my wife at the Overlook Hotel. This is you two having dinner at Chez Laurent. This is you with your hands all over her in the parking lot." Baldwin stared at the photographs, his face cycling through surprise, fear, and calculation. "What do you want?" "Information. I want to know everything about your relationship with my wife. How it started, what she's told you about me, what promises you've made her, and if I don't cooperate." David leaned forward. "Then these photos go to every newspaper in the county, along with the documentation showing how you've been manipulating the permit process. Your political career ends, your ex-wife's lawyers get very interested in your hidden assets, and my wife becomes your problem full-time." Baldwin was quiet for a long moment, weighing his options. Finally, he spoke. "What specifically do you want to know?" "Start with how it began." For the next hour, Baldwin laid out the sordid details. The affair had started at a city planning meeting where Claire had been representing a client. Baldwin had been immediately attracted to her, had pursued her aggressively. Claire had been receptive, complaining about her marriage, about feeling trapped in a life she'd never really wanted. "She told me you were controlling, that you monitored her every move," Baldwin said. "She said she'd married you for security but had never been happy." David listened without emotion, filing away each revelation. "What about Ryan?" Baldwin shifted uncomfortably. "What about him? Is he your son?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Baldwin's face told David everything he needed to know before the man even spoke. "Claire was pregnant when we met," Baldwin said carefully. "She told me the timing was uncertain. But you think he's yours?" "Claire says he might be. We never got a paternity test." David stood up, collecting the photographs. "One more thing. What were your plans? What was Claire going to do about our marriage?" "She was going to leave you. We discussed it. After the Henderson Plaza project was finished, she was going to file for divorce. I was going to help her get a good settlement." David smiled, a cold expression that made Baldwin shrink back in his chair. "Change of plans, Trevor. You're going to help me with something instead." That evening at the hospital, David found Claire sitting beside Ryan's bed, reading him a sports magazine. She looked up when David entered, her smile bright and loving. "How was your day, honey?" she asked. "Productive. Had an interesting meeting at City Hall." "How was lunch with your mother?" Claire's smile faltered slightly. "Fine. She's just worried about things. You know how she gets." David sat down in the chair across from his wife, studying her face. "What kind of things?" "Oh, financial stuff. She's been thinking about her will, making sure everything's in order." Claire's voice was casual, but David could see the tension in her shoulders. "That's thoughtful of her. It's important to plan for the future." "Yes, it is." Claire reached over and took David's hand. "David, I've been thinking about us, about our family. When Ryan gets out of the hospital, maybe we should take that vacation I mentioned. Just the 3 of us." David squeezed her hand gently. "That sounds nice. Where did you have in mind?" "Somewhere far away. Maybe California, or even Europe. Somewhere we can make new memories." David nodded, understanding perfectly. Claire was planning to run. Baldwin had probably told her about David's visit, and now she was trying to buy time to escape with Ryan. "I think that's a wonderful idea," David said. "Why don't you start looking into some options? Money's no object." Claire's relief was visible. "Really? You're not too busy with work?" "Family comes first," David replied. "It always has." Later that night, after Claire had gone home to shower and change clothes, David sat alone with Ryan. The boy was sleeping peacefully, the monitors beeping steadily. David brushed a strand of hair from Ryan's forehead, the same gesture he'd made 1,000 times over the past 14 years. Whether Ryan was his biological son or not didn't matter anymore. The boy was innocent in all of this. But Claire and Trevor Baldwin were about to learn that David Mitchell was not a man who forgave betrayal. And Margaret Fisher was going to help him teach them that lesson. Chapter 6, Web of Lies. The plan David had crafted was intricate, built on the foundation of his enemy's own weaknesses and lies. Margaret had unwittingly become his most valuable asset, her guilt over the hit and run making her desperately compliant with his demands. The lunch meeting between Margaret and Claire had gone exactly as David had orchestrated. Margaret, following David's script, had told Claire that she was updating her will and needed to discuss Claire's inheritance. More importantly, she'd planted the seed that David was becoming suspicious and that Claire needed to be more careful. "Your mother is quite the actress," David told Margaret during their secret meeting at a coffee shop across town. Claire bought every word. Margaret looked haggard, the stress of the deception aging her visibly. "This has to end, David. I can't keep lying to my daughter." "It will end soon," David assured her. "But first, you're going to make another call to Claire. Tell her you've been thinking about the family situation and you want to meet with Trevor Baldwin." "Why would I want to meet with him?" "Because you're concerned about Claire's future. You want to make sure he's serious about her, that he's not just using her for information about my business." David leaned forward. "Tell her you want to evaluate him as a potential son-in-law." Margaret's eyes widened. "She'll never believe that. I've always been critical of her choices." "Exactly. Which is why she'll believe you're being practical. You're a wealthy woman, Margaret. You want to make sure any man in Claire's life is worthy of your money." The next day, Margaret made the call. David listened from his office as she played her part perfectly. Claire was initially resistant, but Margaret's mention of protecting the family assets and making sure Claire's future was secure eventually convinced her. "I'll talk to Trevor," Claire had said. "Maybe we could all have dinner. It would be good for you to get to know him." The dinner was arranged for the following Saturday at Romano's, an upscale Italian restaurant where Margaret was well known. David had spent years in construction learning that the most effective traps were the ones where the victims walked in willingly. While Margaret was setting the bait, David was working on another front. He'd had Frank Morrison dig deeper into Trevor Baldwin's background, and what they'd found was a goldmine of leverage. "The guy's got a gambling problem," Frank reported. "Big debts to some not-so-nice people. That expensive lifestyle isn't funded by his city salary." "How big are the debts?" "$250,000, maybe more. He's been using his position to take bribes from contractors, but even that's not keeping up with his losses." David smiled. A desperate man made mistakes, and David was about to give Trevor Baldwin a reason to be very desperate indeed. On Thursday, David arranged to have Baldwin audited by the State Ethics Commission. It was easy enough. An anonymous tip about irregularities in the permit process, backed up by documentation that Frank had helped David compile. The audit wouldn't find anything immediately damaging, but it would put Baldwin under scrutiny and increase his stress level. David also had Frank spread rumors in the right circles about Baldwin's gambling debts. Within days, Baldwin's creditors were applying pressure, demanding payment on accelerated schedules. By Friday, Baldwin was starting to crack. He'd called Claire multiple times, his conversations growing increasingly frantic. David watched his wife's stress levels rise as she tried to manage her lover's panic while maintaining her facade at home. "Is everything all right?" David asked Claire that evening as she hung up from yet another hushed phone conversation. "Fine," Claire replied quickly. "Just Margaret. She's nervous about tomorrow night's dinner." David nodded sympathetically. "It's a big step for her, accepting someone new into the family. But I'm sure she'll like Trevor once she gets to know him." Claire's eyes widened slightly at David's casual use of her lover's name. "How do you?" "I mean, yes, I'm sure she will." "You mentioned him before," David said innocently. "The city planning commissioner, right? I've heard good things about him around town." Saturday evening arrived with a thunderstorm that seemed ominous and fitting. David had positioned himself at the bar of Romano's before Margaret, Claire, and Trevor arrived. He wore a baseball cap and kept his face turned away, but he could see their table perfectly in the restaurant's mirrors. Trevor Baldwin looked like a man on the edge. His usual polished appearance was slightly disheveled, his movements jerky with nervous energy. Claire was trying to present him in the best light, but David could see the strain in her posture. Margaret played her role beautifully. She questioned Trevor about his career, his financial prospects, his intentions toward Claire. David watched Baldwin grow increasingly uncomfortable as Margaret's questions became more probing. "Claire tells me you're very successful," Margaret said, her voice carrying across the quiet restaurant. "I've always believed that a man's worth can be measured by how he handles his responsibilities." "I do my best," Trevor replied, his voice tight. "That's admirable. Claire's father was the same way, very responsible with money. He taught me that financial stability is the foundation of any good marriage. David could see Trevor's hands shaking slightly as he reached for his wine glass. The man was drowning in debt, under investigation by the state, and now being evaluated by his lover's wealthy mother. The pressure was exactly where David wanted it. The conversation continued for 2 hours, with Margaret masterfully applying psychological pressure while Claire tried desperately to salvage the evening. By the time they parted ways, Trevor looked like he'd aged 5 years. David paid his bar tab and slipped out before they could spot him. Phase 1 of his plan was complete. Trevor Baldwin was now desperate, isolated, and primed for the trap David was about to spring. On Sunday morning, David received exactly the call he'd been expecting. Trevor Baldwin, voice tight with panic, asking to meet privately. The fish had taken the bait. Chapter 7. The Trap Springs. David met Trevor Baldwin at a construction site on the outskirts of town, one of David's projects that had been stalled due to permit delays that Baldwin himself had orchestrated. The irony wasn't lost on either man as they stood among the skeletal steel frames that should have been a completed office building months ago. "You have to help me," Baldwin said without preamble. "The state audit, the creditors, Claire's mother, it's all falling apart." David leaned against his pickup truck, studying the man who'd been destroying his life. Baldwin looked haggard, desperate, exactly where David wanted him. "What makes you think I'd help you, Trevor?" "Because if I go down, Claire goes down with me. The permit information, the bid details she passed along, she's implicated in all of it." "So you're threatening my wife?" Baldwin held up his hands. "No, I'm trying to protect her. But I need money, fast. My creditors aren't the patient type." David pretended to consider this. "How much money?" "200,000. Just as a loan. I'll pay you back with interest." "And what do I get in return?" "I disappear. In the relationship with Claire, transfer to another city. You get your wife back, and she never knows you were involved." David laughed, a sound without humor. "You think I want her back? After what you two have done?" Baldwin's desperation deepened. "Then what do you want?" "Justice," David said simply. "And you're going to help me get it." Over the next hour, David laid out his proposition. Baldwin would cooperate in documenting every detail of his corrupt activities and Claire's involvement. He would wear a wire to their meetings, record their conversations, build an airtight case that would destroy both their reputations and careers. "In exchange," David continued, "I'll give you enough money to pay off your debts and disappear. But you have to give me everything. Every email, every text message, every recorded conversation that proves Claire was working with you." Baldwin was trapped, and he knew it. "What guarantee do I have that you won't turn me in any way?" "You don't. But you're dead either way if you don't take this deal. At least this way, you might survive." That evening, David returned home to find Claire in the kitchen, furiously scrubbing pots that were already clean. Her movements were sharp, agitated. "How was your day?" David asked, settling into his usual chair at the kitchen table. "Fine," Claire snapped, then caught herself and forced a smile. "Sorry, I'm just tired." "How's Ryan?" "Better, every day. The doctors think he'll be ready to come home by the end of the week." Claire nodded, but David could see she was barely listening. Her phone buzzed with a text message, and she grabbed it quickly, reading with obvious anxiety. "Everything all right? Just Margaret. She's still processing dinner last night." Claire's laugh was forced. She can be pretty intimidating when she wants to be. David nodded sympathetically. He knew exactly what text message Claire had received, because Trevor Baldwin had sent it on David's instructions. "Need to see you tonight. Emergency. Why don't you go see her?" David suggested. "I know she's been stressed about family stuff lately. Maybe you could help her work through whatever's bothering her." Claire looked surprised. Usually, David discouraged her evening outings. "Are you sure? I know you've been tired from all the hospital visits." "I'll be fine. Family's important." An hour later, Claire left to meet Trevor, not knowing that their conversation would be recorded on devices that David had provided. While they met, David drove to Margaret's house for his own meeting. Margaret lived in an elegant colonial in the historic district, surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens that she tended obsessively. David found her in her greenhouse, nervously repotting orchids. "How did dinner go?" David asked. "He's weak," Margaret said without looking up. "Desperate. Claire doesn't see it, but I do. She's always been attracted to men who need saving." "Is that why she married me?" Margaret finally looked at him. "No. She married you because you were safe. stable, different from the boys she'd dated before. She paused. I thought it was a good match at the time, but not anymore. Now I think she was just running from one kind of cage to another. The difference is, you built yours out of love. Trevor's is built out of need. David sat down on a potting stool, studying his mother-in-law. There's something I need you to do. Tomorrow, I want you to call Claire and tell her you've decided to change your will. Change it how? Tell her you're leaving everything to Ryan, with you as the trustee until he turns 25. Tell her you've lost confidence in her judgment after meeting Trevor. Margaret's hands stilled on the orchid she was repotting. That will devastate her. Good. I want her devastated. I want her desperate. Because desperate people make mistakes, and I need Claire to make one final mistake. As if on cue, David's phone buzzed with a text from Trevor. She's leaving. Everything recorded as discussed. David stood up, brushing dirt from his hands. Phase 2 complete. Tomorrow, we finish this. That night, David lay in bed listening to Claire's quiet sobs in the bathroom. She thought he was asleep, but he was wide awake, planning the final moves in the game that would destroy her completely. The recording from Trevor's meeting with Claire was everything David had hoped for. Claire had confessed to passing along bid information, to helping Trevor manipulate the permit process, to planning their escape together once they could access Margaret's money. Most damning of all, she'd admitted that she'd never loved David, that their entire marriage had been a comfortable lie, and that she couldn't wait to start over with a man who understood her needs. Tomorrow, David would play that recording for Margaret, and then Margaret would make the phone call that would drive Claire to her final, fatal mistake. Chapter 8. The Reckoning. Margaret's phone call to Claire came at 8:30 a.m., just as Claire was getting ready to visit Ryan in the hospital. David listened from the kitchen as Claire's side of the conversation grew increasingly shrill. What do you mean you're changing your will? Claire's voice rose. Mother, you can't be serious. David could hear Margaret's responses faintly through the phone. Calm, measured, devastating. She was following David's script perfectly, explaining that she'd lost confidence in Claire's judgment, that she wanted to protect the family money from Claire's poor choices. Trevor has nothing to do with this. Claire protested. This is about our family. But Margaret was relentless. By the time the call ended, Claire was in tears, her carefully constructed life crumbling around her. David found her in the bathroom, gripping the vanity as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Honey, what's wrong? David asked, playing the concerned husband. It's nothing, Claire said quickly, trying to compose herself. Just family drama. Are you sure? You look upset. For a moment, Claire looked like she might tell him the truth. Then her walls went back up. I'm fine. I just need to get to the hospital. David nodded and kissed her forehead gently. I'll meet you there later. I have a few business calls to make first. The first call was to Trevor Baldwin. Phase 3, David said simply. Are you sure about this? Trevor's voice was tight with anxiety. Positive. Remember, you get the money after she's completely destroyed. Not before. The second call was to Frank Morrison. It's time. Have the lawyers file the papers. By noon, Claire's world was disintegrating completely. The divorce papers were served at the hospital, in front of Ryan, who was scheduled to be discharged that afternoon. The papers detailed adultery, fraud, and demanded full custody of Ryan along with criminal charges for Claire's role in the permit fraud. But David wasn't finished. The papers also included a paternity challenge, demanding DNA testing to determine if Ryan was actually David's biological son. Claire's face went white as she read the documents. Daddy, what's happening? Ryan asked from his hospital bed, confused and frightened by the legal papers scattered around the room. Just some paperwork, son, David said gently. Don't worry about it. But Claire was past hiding. David, we need to talk. Privately, they stepped into the hallway, leaving Ryan with a nurse. Claire's composure had completely shattered. How long have you known? She whispered. About Trevor? Months. About Ryan's paternity? Since his blood work came back. David's voice was calm, matter of fact. The question is, how long have you been lying to me? David, please. I know this looks bad, but... Looks bad. David's voice rose, causing nurses to glance in their direction. You've been cheating on me for over a year. You've been helping your lover steal from my business. And now I find out that the son I've loved and raised for 14 years might not even be mine. Claire reached for him, but David stepped back. It's not what you think. I love you, David. I've always loved you. You have a funny way of showing it. The thing with Trevor, it just happened. I was lonely, and you were always working, and what about Ryan? Is he mine or not? Claire's silence was answer enough. David felt something cold and final settle in his chest. I see. So our entire marriage has been a lie. No. I mean, yes, the timing was uncertain when I got pregnant. But David, you're his father in every way that matters. You raised him, you love him. And you were content to let me believe he was mine while you planned to run away with his real father. Claire's tears started again. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. I was going to tell you. When? After you'd cleaned out our bank accounts and disappeared? Before Claire could answer, David's phone rang. It was Trevor Baldwin, right on schedule. David, you need to come to the police station. I'm here with the detectives. They want to talk to you about Claire. David hung up and looked at his wife. That was Trevor. He's decided to cooperate with the investigation into the permit fraud. Apparently, he's very willing to testify about your role in stealing my business contracts. Claire's face went ashen. He wouldn't. He loves me. Love. David laughed harshly. Trevor doesn't love you, Claire. He used you to make money and destroy me. And now he's saving himself by throwing you under the bus. The final blow came when Margaret arrived at the hospital an hour later. She walked past Claire without acknowledgement and went straight to Ryan's bedside. Grandma. Ryan brightened. Did you know Mom and Dad are getting divorced? Margaret's face was stern as she looked at her daughter. Yes, sweetheart. Sometimes adults make choices that hurt the people they're supposed to protect. Margaret, Claire pleaded. You're my mother. How can you side with him? Because he's the one who's been taking care of this family while you've been destroying it, Margaret replied coldly. David may not be perfect, but he's never lied to us. Can you say the same? That evening, Claire came to the house one last time to pack her belongings. David watched from the kitchen window as she loaded suitcases into her car, her movements mechanical, defeated. She paused at the front door, looking back at the house she'd lived in for 15 years. Then she knocked. David answered, but didn't invite her in. I just wanted to say goodbye, Claire said softly, and to tell you that I'm sorry. For all of it. Are you? Yes. I know you don't believe me, but I am. I made horrible choices, and I hurt people I love. David studied her face, looking for any sign of the woman he'd once loved. You're sorry you got caught. That's not true, isn't it? If Trevor hadn't panicked, if the audit hadn't happened, if Ryan hadn't remembered your mother's license plate, you'd still be lying to me right now. Claire had no answer for that. Goodbye, Claire, David said, and closed the door. Chapter 9, Blood Price. 6 months later, David stood in his office overlooking the construction yard where Mitchell Construction had resumed its steady growth. The permits were flowing normally again, the bids were fair, and David's reputation in the industry had actually improved once word spread about how he'd handled his wife's betrayal. Claire was awaiting trial on fraud charges, having been unable to make bail after Trevor Baldwin's testimony detailed her extensive involvement in the permit manipulation scheme. Her mother's money was tied up in legal proceedings, and no one else was willing to help the woman who'd betrayed her husband and business partners. Trevor Baldwin had disappeared after providing his testimony, supposedly relocated through some kind of witness protection arrangement that David had arranged through his contacts. In reality, Baldwin was buried under the foundation of a warehouse David was building outside town. Some betrayals demanded more than legal justice. Margaret had kept her word about changing her will, leaving everything to Ryan with David as trustee. The hit-and-run charges had been quietly dropped after Margaret provided new information that led to the arrest of a convenient scapegoat, a homeless man with a history of car theft who'd conveniently died of an overdose before he could deny the charges. Ryan was thriving. The paternity test had confirmed what David already knew. The boy wasn't his biological son. But David had discovered that blood meant less than loyalty, and Ryan had proven his loyalty by choosing to stay with the man who'd raised him rather than visit the mother who'd lied to him his entire life. I don't care who my real father is, Ryan had told David. You're my dad. That's what matters. The boy had grown up fast in the aftermath of the divorce, understanding more about his mother's betrayal than David had expected. Rather than feeling sorry for Claire, Ryan had been angry about her deception, about her willingness to let David believe a lie for 14 years. David's phone rang, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Frank Morrison. The Claire problem is handled, Frank reported. Prison transport had an accident on the way to court this morning. Single vehicle rollover. No survivors. David felt a cold satisfaction settle in his chest. Claire's trial would have been a prolonged embarrassment, her testimony potentially damaging to his reputation. This was cleaner. What about the investigation? Mechanical failure. These transport vehicles are old, poorly maintained. Accidents happen. David hung up and walked to the window overlooking his domain. Mitchell Construction was stronger than ever, his reputation enhanced by his handling of adversity. Ryan was excelling in school and showing real aptitude for the construction business. Margaret had become a devoted grandmother and business partner, managing the company's finances with the same ruthless efficiency she'd once applied to protecting her daughter's secrets. That evening, David and Ryan worked together in the garage, installing new equipment for the workshop. The boy had his mother's intelligence but David's work ethic, a combination that would serve him well in life. "Dad," Ryan said as they tightened bolts on a new drill press. "What happened to Mom? Was it really an accident?" David continued working, his hands steady on the wrench. "What makes you ask that? Just seems like a lot of bad luck. The fraud charges, the trial, now the accident." David stopped working and looked at his son. The boy was 15 now, old enough to understand certain truths about the world. "Ryan, there's something you need to learn about life. When people betray you, when they try to destroy everything you've built, you have two choices. You can forgive them and hope they've learned their lesson, or you can make sure they never get the chance to hurt you again. And you chose option 2? I chose to protect our family. Your mother made her choices, and those choices had consequences." Ryan nodded slowly, processing this information. "And if someone betrayed me, what would you do?" David smiled, a cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. "The same thing I do to anyone who hurt my son. I destroy them completely." They returned to their work in comfortable silence, the bond between them stronger than any biological connection could have been. David had learned that family wasn't about blood, it was about loyalty, about standing together against the world's betrayals. Outside, snow was beginning to fall, covering the evidence of the foundation work where Trevor Baldwin lay entombed in concrete. Spring would bring new construction projects, new opportunities to build and grow. But David had learned the most important lesson of all. In a world full of betrayers and liars, the only people you could trust were the ones who'd proven their loyalty when everything was at stake. Ryan had passed that test. Margaret had passed it too, in her own way. As for everyone else, well, David had always been good with his hands, building things up, tearing them down, burying the debris where no one would ever find it. The Mitchell legacy would continue, built on a foundation of blood, loyalty, and the understanding that some betrayals could never be forgiven. David had taught his enemies that lesson permanently, and if anyone else tried to threaten his family, they would learn it too.